Alright, I'm not gonna lie, this is a video that I've kind of been dreading making. Now, that may seem weird to you, considering I said in my last video that this is my favorite game of all time, but, alright, I'll just get this out of the way now so I can focus on the game later. Secret of Mana is a game I've been going back to for decades. Even when I first got it, when everybody else was playing Super Mario Kart or Street Fighter 2 or whatever sports game came out no, not that sports game. I was playing this with my friends, and even as time has gone on and I've grown up, gotten jobs, moved to different places, I still keep going back to this game, and I'm usually not alone. Some of the people I consider my closest friends, most of them at some point have played and beaten Secret of Mana with me. I mean, it's left a lasting impact on me, and you can even see it around my home. This is what my console tower looks like. This is what my coffee table looks like. This is what the door to my refrigerator looks like. And this is what it looks like when I introduce the second part of the Seiken Densetsu retrospective, Seiken Densetsu 2, aka Secret of Mana. Well, at least it's not 3 different names this time.
After Final Fantasy Adventure, Square went to work building a name for itself on Nintendo's newest system, the Super Famicom. They hit the ground running with Final Fantasy IV. This was followed by Final Fantasy V, Romancing Saga, and Mystic Quest. No, the other Mystic Quest. Yeah, there you go. Hey, they can't all be winners, right? Then in August of 1993, Seiken Densetsu 2 hit store shelves in Japan, followed by an October 3rd release that same year for North America, which put it 9 days before the release of Zombies Ate My Neighbors and 9 days after Arrow the Acrobat.
It might not sound like much, but back in 1993, you could not open a video game magazine without seeing at least 2 ads and 1 article hyping the hell out of Arrow the Acrobat. I mean, at least this wasn't on the Genesis, otherwise it would have released within a month of Rocket Knight Adventures and one of my favorite Genesis games, Gunstar Heroes.
Oh, and Europe didn't see Secret of Mana until October of 1994. Because Europe. Seiken Densetsu 2, aka Secret of Mana, had several notable people behind it. Aside from Koichi Ishii in his roles as game/animation/monster designer and director, his key partners in development included lead programmer Nasir Gabelli, and producer and system designer Hiromichi Tanaka, both of whom worked on the first 3 Final Fantasy games like Ishii did. According to Mr. Tanaka, Secret of Mana started off as Final Fantasy IV, but it wound up being so different from its predecessors that it became its own thing. This game marks a big turning point for the Seiken Densetsu series. This is where, despite still having references to things from Final Fantasy, it became a series of its own with no direct attachment to Final Fantasy, becoming known as the Mana series in the West. This despite the game initially being advertised in a couple magazines as Final Fantasy Adventure 2.
Oops. And it's weird to say this, given how the game was received critically and how it's still looked back on fondly by many people, but Seiken Densetsu 2 almost didn't exist. And when it did, it's amazing it wasn't a complete train wreck.
I hope you're sitting comfortably and have something to drink because this might take a while to explain. Seiken Densetsu 2, when it was officially going to be Seiken Densetsu 2 and not Final Fantasy IV, went into development as what would have been a launch title for the SNES CD-ROM system, which is exactly what it sounds like. This was being worked on by Sony as far back as 1988, 2 years before the Super Famicom launched in Japan. Nintendo took another look at their contract with Sony and didn't like that Sony had control not just over the disc format itself, but also the licensing of software for the disc system. Nintendo went behind Sony's back to their rival Philips and made a more favorable deal with them. Just to make things more awkward, this partnership was announced the day after Sony announced the cartridge CD console, then called the PlayStation, at the 1991 Consumer Electronics Show. Sony wound up splitting from Nintendo, taking away the space between Play and Station, and making their own console with the technology, while Nintendo and Philips never wound up making a CD-ROM addition to the SNES. But hey, at least Philips got some Nintendo games not developed by Nintendo out of it, which would end up being best known as YouTube poop material.
YouTube poop. Where there's smoke, they pinch back.
So what did all of this mean for Seiken Densetsu 2? The developers initially thought the project should be scrapped entirely. However, the higher-ups at Square, possibly remembering how the emergence of Excalibur got cancelled and thinking, oh god, not this shit again, told them to condense the game so it could fit on a cartridge. Huge problem though. Seiken Densetsu 2 was being made to fit on a CD-ROM, which can hold over 600 megabytes of data. SNES cartridges have a max capacity of 16 megabytes. Less than that actually, because about 1.4 megabytes isn't available for writing data. As such, according to Ishii and company, nearly half of the game's content was cut, including story events, enemies, and locations, as well as branching stories and additional endings so it could fit on a cartridge. Ishii described the process as messy and incredibly stressful, saying, quote, "I'm honestly surprised that the finished game did not become an unmitigated disaster." It wasn't entirely in vain though, as some of their unused ideas or cut material went toward another Square RPG on the SNES. Maybe you've heard of it. Chrono Trigger. Which may explain why a couple characters from both games look a little similar.
Cartridges became a point of contention later as well when Nintendo made the Nintendo 64. How much did this sour Square on Nintendo? Well, just a moment. I'm holding in my hands all of the games Square made for the Nintendo 64.
Back to Seiken Densetsu 2. As if there weren't enough problems already trying to cram a proverbial square peg into a much smaller round hole, there was a whole other issue: the English translation. Head translator Ted Woolsey, who worked on 2 Square games prior to this and also has to his name games like Breath of Fire and Super Mario RPG, said that due to several factors, translating Seiken Densetsu 2, quote, "nearly killed me." A good Japanese to English translation for a text-heavy game usually takes several months, but he was asked to do it in one, possibly so the game could release ahead of the Christmas season. Woolsey finished a translation and sent it to Square, only to be told that the text went way over the memory left on the cartridge and cuts would have to be made. The game uses a fixed-width font, which means it's limited in how many characters it can display. Several lines of dialogue were left out, and much of what was left got simplified. By Woolsey's estimate, probably 40% or more of the screen text was nuked. Making matters worse was that the text he translated typically wasn't in sequence, just given to him in large chunks to be sorted out later.
Let's put it this way. Let's say I ask you to translate this book from Japanese to English. But before I give you the book, I open it up, tear out all of the page numbers, rip out all of the pages, throw them up in the air, gather them up in whatever order I please, shove them back in the book, and then I give it to you. By the way, you only have 30 days to do this, and you'll have to cut several pages due to space limitations. Now get to it!
Nevertheless, Seiken Densetsu 2 was crammed onto a Super Famicom cartridge and released. Along with it came a laundry list of publications. In Japan there was the strategy guide, of course, but like the first game it had 2 knowledge-based books, one fundamental knowledge book and a complete walkthrough book. There was also a scoop book, as well as a guidebook published by Family Computer magazine, the former of which is like a cross between an instruction book and an advertisement. V-Jump had a publication on the game, and 2 other knowledge books were printed. They also had this ad running on TV.
Square News! 本日発売前より話題沸騰の聖剣伝説2のゲーム画面が発表になりましたのでご紹介します。しかしこの聖剣伝説2の最大の目玉は何といっても今巷で噂の聖剣伝説2。
I spent longer than I'd care to admit trying to find that flammy doll thing, as well as the ones for the 3 main characters. Meanwhile, North America and Europe got a very different ad.
あな
peaceful land, paradise is threatened by an unspeakable evil, and only one person has found the power to restore perfect order. In a new action-adventure game for your Super NES comes an exciting tale, The Secret of Mana, from Square, maker of the world's greatest video games.
There was also a little promotion on the part of Nintendo Power, which put it on the cover and gave it a 10-page feature in Volume 54. Is that supposed to be Flammy? Because that doesn't look anything like Flammy. That doesn't even look like the dragon enemies in the game. And speaking of the game, why does the game start with a whale call? Well, why not? According to the game's composer, he wanted it to sound like the undying mana tree crying out. It's a massive living thing that towers over most everything on land, the way some whales tower over everything in the sea, and it also builds on and complements the calm landscape around it.
Or maybe he just thought it sounded cool. Both are acceptable answers to me.
Right away, this is different from the Japanese version. There, the title graphic is zoomed out more, showing way more of the mana tree and the area around it. The international versions might have been zoomed in due to an especially blurry part of the tree which was covered up by the Japanese title graphic, but the English one was too small to hide it completely. Anyway, the startup text talks about how in a land shrouded in darkness, its people await a hero, wielding a sword known by many different names, but in all legends and myths, it is the same weapon, the Sword of Mana.
Not yet.
Secret of Mana's story really starts several years before When You Take Control. It tells of a time when man harnessed the power of mana to create an ultimate weapon known as the Mana Fortress. This pissed off the gods and they sent down monsters to destroy it, thus kicking off a war which damaged much of the planet. With the world at its brink, a knight destroys the fortress with the Mana Sword, which, even after playing this, I don't know how the sword does that, and while the civilization was destroyed, the world was finally at peace. However, if there's one thing humanity is really good at, it's never learning from its mistakes. And we get our first look at Secret of Mana's use at Mode 7, a scaling and rotation tool often used to give the illusion of three-dimensional graphics. This game makes use of it at several points, namely for travel sequences. Focus shifts to 3 kids crossing a log by a waterfall, and if you want to know how smart the other 2 kids are, one of them is wearing what looks like a dunce cap. At the beginning you play as the one boy, whose name is Randy, but he can be called anything up to 6 characters long. They talk about how they're disobeying the Elder by being here, and rumors about treasure near the falls. But Randy loses his balance and falls off the log, at which point Elliot and Timothy pretend they didn't just witness their friend's death. Nope, never mind, he's just fine.
What is it with these games having their protagonists survive long drops in front of waterfalls? At least Sumo landed in a moderately deep river and washed ashore before regaining consciousness. This kid lands head first in maybe 2 feet of water and immediately hops back to his feet.
Now you have to find a way back to town, and this is where the game gets you used to the movement controls. It's pretty self-explanatory, moving around in 8 directions instead of 4 like last game, except none of it's grid-based and there's a run button which lets you move faster in a straight line. And it needs to recharge before being used again just like the weapon system, but more on that in a bit. Randy shrugs off a phantom voice calling his name and can't get back into town without cutting his way through some thick greenery. Fortunately, there's a sword and a stone nearby. Yes, the King Arthur references are a bit more blatant here. And before you ask, the sword does get named Excalibur at one point. The voice tells Randy to pull out the sword, and he does. A ghost appears before him asking for the sword, which Randy holds up and... oh, whatever. The same thing happens to me when I'm trying to get decent reception with my phone. Cutting through the greenery leads Randy to a rabbite, a creature which usually doesn't show up this close to the village, and the game truly begins. This walk back to the village is your introduction to Secret of Mana's combat system. There's one button for melee attacks, and every time you use your weapon, there's a cooldown period, shown by the percentage bar at the bottom of the screen. There's also an audio cue and the character sprite changing color to go by, so you're not just looking at the bottom of the screen most of the time. If you don't wait for the cooldown to finish, your attacks become much weaker, so you can't just mash the attack button for every enemy you see. I mean, you can try, but it makes defeating enemies much slower. It's a much more dramatic difference in damage values compared to Final Fantasy Adventure's combat system. In some cases, you can't do that at all. Enemies have a couple different reactions to attacks, usually based on how much damage they take. Some of them leave the enemy open to being attacked again while stunned, but others leave them invulnerable to physical attacks until they can move again. This varies on an enemy-by-enemy basis, as do their death animations, though there are only a few of these in the game. Some of them turn into a pile of bones, or another pile of bones. Some of them burst into sparkling water, some of them become a pile of feathers, or turn into a wisp and disappear, and some of them just plain
Explode!
Of course, there's the chance the enemy evades the attack, or is invulnerable to it entirely. You can tell if that's the case by no damage values appearing, or by this sound. Randy and company can also evade attacks, doing either a block animation or briefly imitating a martial arts movie. What also varies by enemy? Treasure drops. Sometimes an enemy will leave behind a treasure chest, and sometimes it sprouts legs and tries to run away, though they're pretty easy to corner. It's usually fixed to one or two items you can possibly get from an enemy, either a healing item or some gold pieces. Some, however, want a little revenge from beyond the grave and set traps in these things. They can be rigged with punch gloves, or time bombs, or knockout gas, or laced with poison needles. Some have doom traps inside of them which have a chance of outright killing you. Even when they don't, they lower your hit points to 1. Traps can only be disarmed with a spell you get later on because, well, rogues don't show up until the next game. Each enemy killed gives a couple kinds of experience. One is regular experience points, which lead to level ups, which completely refill your health. Unlike the previous title, Secret of Mana doesn't let you choose how stat points are distributed. Every character has a laundry list of statistics which automatically increase in a pattern specific to them. In Randy's case, he's the quote-unquote warrior of the group. So his best stats are things like strength, attack, defense, hit and evade percentage, etc. It also means he's the dumbest character. Look at how low it is compared to everything else.
Then again, based on his hanging out with people like Elliot and Timothy, you could probably guess he wasn't that smart.
Another kind of experience you can get is for weapon skill. Each weapon starts at level 0 for each character and can go up to 9, except for the sword. Once you earn 100 points, either by defeating enemies or being alive in the party while they defeat enemies, that character's weapon level goes up and they can use a charge attack by holding the attack button. These become more powerful and dramatic as you let the bar charge to each additional level. Sure, it takes a long time for the higher levels and you move really slow, but with some party coordination, it can still be pulled off. Anyway, Randy gets back to the village, and on top of monsters popping up around it, a strange man dressed like a knight appears at the local tavern. Meanwhile, the item shop here is your introduction to the ring command system. This was pretty damn impressive at the time, keeping menu text at a minimum while using icons to form a simple way to navigate between everything you need. It's how every menu and store displays its various items and options, usually with a unique icon for each piece of armor available and a headshot of which characters can equip it. Equipment in Secret of Mana, with the same 3 slots as before, only boosts defense. It doesn't have unlisted hidden properties like some armor did in Final Fantasy Adventure. Although there was that one time I was immune to sleep spells until I swapped armor. While the sprites do differentiate themselves across most armor pieces, they don't quite measure up to the original art associated with them. I know I would take the fancy overalls body armor much more seriously if it looked like it's Sorry, I got a little sidetracked. Fortunately, the armor is laid out by shop in such a way that whenever you get to a new location, the armor is usually a clear upgrade. By the halfway point, not buying it is usually a surefire way to get outright slaughtered. Character menus are divided into 3 sections, which can be cycled through with up and down on the D-pad. One is for items, the second is weapons, and the third is a series of submenus, including things like equipment, status, display options, and AI controls. Items in Secret of Mana, ones that are single-use at least, can stack up to 4, much fewer than most RPGs at the time.
This, of course, is to have an element of realism in the fantasy RPG. by making it so you can only carry 4 jars of honey, 4 candy bars, 4 candies, 4 medicinal herbs, 4 chalices, 4 large barrels, a hammer, a belt, and some miscellaneous other crap in your pocket. Really though, I'm okay with dispensable items only being limited to 4, because if they raised the item limit too much, this game would have been way too easy.
The ring can get crowded if there are too many items, which is probably why, aside from cuts, there aren't that many items in Secret of Mana. There are only 3 healing items, 1 magic recovery item, and 1 item, the medicinal herb, which cures every status ailment besides being dead. Aside from the obvious healing and status ailment items, since this game adds having to bring back dead characters, the Cup of Wishes serves that function, bringing someone back to life and completely restoring their health. Clearly not related to the Holy Grail, which could supposedly cure all wounds. As for the barrel, it makes you invulnerable, at the price of not being able to move quickly or attack anything. While the items are heavily consolidated, each serves a clear function which ensures they'll be used at least semi-regularly. Personally, I'll take that over a massive backlog of items I almost never use. Anyway, Randy and the others get chewed out by the Elder, who then sees Randy pulled out the Mana Sword which was protecting Poto's village. Elliot, after realizing the treasure they were after has doomed everyone, starts smacking Randy around until an earthquake hits and both of them end up in a cave with a mantis ant, the game's first boss.
I hope you like bosses, because Secret of Mana has a lot of them. 41 to be exact. That may not sound like much by RPG standards, but given how long it took me to complete this game, about 12 hours, including some bits where I got lost, I was fighting a boss about once every 20 minutes.
Part of why I don't mind the frequency of boss fights? The music. Secret of Mana's score was composed by Hiroki Kikuta, who's also done the music for a couple other Seiken Densetsu games, Shining Hearts.
Ah, shit, Sega's gonna take down my channel for mentioning the Shining game. Shit, I just mentioned it again, stop!
And more recently, Indivisible. He wasn't originally supposed to work on Secret of Mana, but the previous game's composer, Kenji Ito, had to back out to compose for other games, like Romancing Saga. The uniqueness of his soundtrack is due in large part to one main thing. Square's music department, run by Nobuo Uematsu, was completely separate from the development staff. Because of this separation, Kikuta not only was making music for the game as it was still being laid out, he was given absolutely no direction on how the music should sound. I would have loved to see how that meeting went.
Kikuta-san, your job is to compose the soundtrack for this game we're working on. Okay, what should it sound like? Yes, what should it sound like? That's what I just asked. What should it sound like? I don't fucking know.
As such, aside from a couple of common melodies, Kikuta composed each song individually according to the circumstances under which they play, instead of having a unified theme throughout. Inspirations for songs vary wildly, with some based on, and I'm probably pronouncing these wrong, gamelan and Kasak music from Javanese and Balinese cultures respectively. He also experimented a lot with things like key changes and time signatures, but more importantly, instead of making MIDI files the sound department would then fit with the SNES hardware, he created sound samples according to what the console could handle. He also made use of the number of audio channels available on the system, 8 to be precise. Though this has its drawbacks. Sound effects also need to play, so if a song takes up too many channels or too much memory to play and 2 or 3 sounds need to play at once, part of the music track drops out for 2 seconds or so.
So about that mantis ant.
This is both an introduction to boss battles and getting your ass kicked. Aside from a few palette swaps, bosses move, attack, and generally behave differently. It's okay to die here though, as the man will revive you over and over until the mantis ant explodes, giving you a swords orb, which will come into play later. The man introduces himself as Gemma, wondering why a boy like Randy was able to pull out the sword, and tells him to go to the water palace and talk to Luca. But first the entire town tells Randy he's a monster magnet and to get the hell out, forcing the elder to banish him from the village. See, Randy was left in Potos by his mother when he was a baby, and she disappeared shortly thereafter.
To recap, so far Randy's objectives are recharge the mana sword to get rid of all the monsters, figure out what the hell ever happened to his mother, and redeem himself with the village of people that just kicked him out. Not sure I could have handled all that when I was 16. Oh, that's how old Square says Randy is.
Along the way, Randy comes across the home of a traveling merchant, Neko. I hate this cat. A lot. Even though he pops up along the way when you might need items, his prices are twice as high as what everything usually costs. Also, he's a bit glitchy in some areas, so sometimes he'll appear where he's supposed to, and sometimes he won't. Randy also comes across Major Diluc and his troops. Talking to them causes them to teleport to the woods to take on a witch. Remember Diluc, we're going to be seeing a lot of him. In the Water Palace he meets 200-year-old Luca, who's aged very well, and finds out the sword used its last bit of power to summon him, and he was able to remove it because Mana's power is weakening, which then revived old monsters. He's told that the story about the Mana Fortress is real, and the Empire is trying to bring it back, in part by breaking the seals on all 8 Mana Seeds. After Randy uses the sword to seal the Mana Seed being kept there, Gemma goes to Pandora to talk to their king, while Randy goes to Gaia's navel to get some dwarves to de-rust his sword, but not before being given a spear. On the way there though, Randy joins some goblins. For dinner.
I know what you're thinking. There, I did it for you.
But a girl, who mistakes Randy for someone else, rescues him. Then realizing her mistake, she runs off. I should mention that unlike the previous game, Secret of Mana only lets you save in certain places. You can save at any inns, any traveling merchants, and a couple other key locations like the Water Temple or the gates in the Pure Land. I don't mind this as it makes it much harder to save in unwinnable situations, and there are still tons of places where you can save. Also, the number of save slots is doubled from 2 to 4, and as a little bonus, the game keeps track of how many times you saved. It's also possible to reset the game by holding Start, Select L and R. No turning off the system just to get back to the main menu like before. Anyway, in Pandora, half the townspeople won't talk and hang around some weird ruins to the south. Diluc's not back from his mission, and everyone blames the witch for it. But never mind that shit, the girl from earlier is backing out of an arranged marriage. Named Prim, or Purim, depending on how you want to write it, she recruits you to go save her boyfriend, Diluc.
What about the guy you're backing out of marrying? I mean, I'm sure he has some redeeming qualities about... Never mind, he's a pink version of Elliot. Turn and run and don't look back.
Since I mentioned Randy's 16, if you're wondering how old Prim is...
She's only 17.
And she joins you.
Or at least, that's what's supposed to happen.
Here it's possible to break the game purely by accident. Right after getting kicked out of Potos, you go to the Water Palace. But if you don't talk to any of the soldiers, on the way to Pandora, you won't get kidnapped by goblins. And when you first see Prim in the palace, she just barges past you instead of tagging along. You have to find her home and talk to her, at which point she says she's going to find Diluc herself and disappears. Literally, she pops out of existence, showing that this sequence wasn't entirely finished. You know what else shows how unfinished this is? Her dad's dialogue. He's supposed to say her name, but at this point you haven't entered her name yet. So instead he says, "Go go 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 go." You don't see her again until wandering into the witch's woods, when a teleport brings you to her screaming in terror and a small group of werewolves you're supposed to beat up. The catch is, they're probably much stronger than you, and are not just faster and more aggressive than most of the enemies to this point, they can also cast Cure Water and an attack boost spell. In other words, you're pretty much dead. This can also happen if you try going to Gaia's navel before the woods, assuming you pick the dialogue choices which are most likely to piss her off. By the way, check out what happens if you swap weapons with her after she's left the party. Thanks, Prim! Instead, you should go to the woods and find these skull posts, which apparently can only be destroyed by an axe. And hey, dwarves like axes, right?
And that's profiling. And profiling is wrong.
Sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. Prim is a smart but also blunt and at times forceful character, in case her basically telling the king to go fuck himself isn't enough indication. In battle, she's more of an all-around character. Her strength, attack, defense, constitution, and such are lower than Randy's, but her intelligence, wisdom, and magic defense are higher. Having Prim in the party brings about two things: a new weapon in the spiked knuckles, which have a kicking animation too for whatever reason, and multiplayer. A second person can hit start and instantly drop in or out of the game controlling a character. Even if you're playing solo, you can hit select to swap between them. For the record, it only took me about 40 minutes playing at a leisurely pace to get to the point where she joins the party, so if you're intent on playing with someone, it doesn't take too long to reach that point. This is also a good time to get used to the AI. There are two ways to control how non-player controlled characters act. The first is the target function, in which you can tell a character which enemies to focus on. More important, however, is the action grid. This is where you control how aggressive computer-controlled characters are and, if you want, control what weapon level they charge to before attacking. This is incredibly useful for keeping weaker characters away from enemies, or coordinating multiple characters to converge on a single target. Though I'd often help them out by pushing multiple enemies into one spot. AI movement isn't the greatest, namely when going through narrow or winding passages, but even when they get hung up, you can easily switch to that character and get them unstuck. On the way to Gaia's Navel, you can go to a village where Diluc's parents are. Let's not tell them that he's missing and or possibly dead. In Gaia's Navel is the magic rope. Yup, it's back. You don't really need it, but it's nice to have to get out of some dungeons. Well, the ones where it works anyway. The dwarf village has a guy named Watt, who forges the sword, but his hammer starts glowing with residual mana, and he decides to make it into, conveniently, an axe. Get used to seeing Watt everywhere, because he's the one guy who can forge weapons throughout the game. But first, it's time to get ripped off by a shitty carnival act. Among the participants is a tiny sprite child, begging for money to pay off a debt. Too bad that kid's a lying scumbag. He really did get washed away from his home in a flood, but he was scamming people out of their money to pay his way home. Man, if only there was something to break up this awkward situation. Oh, a giant plant tunneled into town! The sprite apparently lost his memory, but could possibly get it back if he comes in contact with the mana seeds. Somehow. Here, about 40 minutes after Prim joined, the group agrees to bring the sprite, named Papaw, to the underground palace, and so he joins you. If anyone from Europe is watching this and confused as to why I keep calling the sprite he, that's because he's male in the US release, as opposed to being female in the European version.
Well, I guess that makes Japan the tiebreaker. Let's see what they say the sprite is. Unknown.
Papaw is a well-meaning, wise-ass trickster who has the weakest attack and defense in the game, but the highest intelligence. Good thing he has a couple ranged weapons, the bow and the boomerang, so he can keep his distance most of the time. They have to go to the woods because the witch Eleni blocked the way to the underground palace with a lava flow.
Before that, there's something else you can do. If you have the right equipment.
Say hi to the Super Multitap, developed by my old friends at Hudson Soft. Just plug it into controller port 2, and you can get up to 5 controllers hooked up at once. There are a few different multitap devices for the SNES, but this was one of the earliest. Originally made to get up to 4 players in Super Bomberman, which came out 4 months before Seiken Densetsu 2 in Japan, it also works on several other games, including Secret of Mana. With it, all 3 characters can be player-controlled. While the AI on them can be managed to some degree, it is preferable to have people playing as each character so everyone's always on the same page.
Though if you don't have anyone else to play with, you could always do something like, say, sneak back into Poto's village early.
Just run into the villager while mashing select over and over, and BAM! You've unbanished yourself! Multiplayer, according to Tanaka, wasn't supposed to be in the game at first, but they found a way to easily make it so each character could be player-controlled. Ishii, however, said he wanted this to be a 4-player game, but due to technical limitations, it couldn't be done. I can only assume that that 4th player would be Elliot.
Because there's always that one character that no one wants to get stuck playing as.
Watts' axe, which can smash through small rocks, is done, but it only gains power once Randy holds it. As we'll see later, mana flows through Randy for reasons other than lugging around that sword. I should also note something here about weapon progression. Weapons can only be forged if you have an orb for them. This also dictates the maximum weapon level you can reach, and therefore the maximum charge attack you can perform. So if you have a sword that's been forged once, you cap off at level 2. Aside from levels and different damage values, weapons also have their own additional effects when they hit certain levels. The most common ones are being extra effective against lizards, zombies, plants, or other general enemy types, but some boost your stats, like strength or agility. Some have a chance of, for example, slowing enemies down, putting them to sleep, or casting Balloon, effectively immobilizing them. What depth the armor system may lack, the weapons make up for it. Anyway, on the way to Eleni's, you'll find the Moogle status is still a thing, and come across the soldiers, minus Diluc, acting like the people in Pandora. Eleni teleports Diluc to Thanatos in Pandora, who wants to overthrow the kingdom, and sicks her pet spiky tiger on you. One fight later, Eleni reveals she was trading people for Thanatos' herbs since hers died off.
Joke too predictable. Ignored.
She gives you a whip, which you'll be using a lot throughout the game to cross gaps, just like in Final Fantasy Adventure. Well, I guess we're off to Pandora. Nope, the water palace is in trouble. Apparently the seal on the palace is gone, and it means the water elemental Undine is in trouble. Not sure what the trouble is, there's nothing but this enemy that doesn't attack in her... Okay, I take it back, this might be a okay, yes, this is a problem, a significant problem. Undine rewards you with a new weapon, the pole dart, and by giving Prim recovery and defense magic and Papaw offensive magic. Randy, feeling left out, gets told his sword will become stronger than any magic, which is the polite way of saying, you get no magic because your wisdom and intelligence stats are shit.
That's okay, he learns weapons faster than everybody else anyway. Although, there are unused sprites in the game's code that show Randy casting spells. This is also the point when Papaw finally starts pulling his weight with the group.
Magic has its own separate ring in the menu for Prim and Papaw, and progresses in a similar way to weapon levels, but instead of the maximum level you can reach being based on orbs, it's based on how many of the mana seeds you've come in contact with. It's also easy to tell what most spells do thanks to the magic level menu, which describes what each spell for each elemental does. Instead of earning points toward new levels for each enemy defeated, every spell cast for an elemental earns points for them. Each cast of a level 0 spell earns 9 points. Level 1 spells earn 8 points, level 2, 3 points, up to level 8 where each cast earns a single point. If you really want to, magic levels are pretty easy to grind. Just find an inn or a person who restores your health and mana, and chain cast on the nearest enemies or party members. Although I didn't do any level grinding, magic or otherwise, and I got through the game just fine. Just for reference, if you do get in a bind late in the game, it took me a little under half an hour to grind an elemental from level 0 to level 8.
That's also if you don't mind shelling out for fairy walnuts, the only magic recovery item in the game. And guess who's one of the few people that sells them consistently? The cat person thing that charges double for everything.
Undine's probably going to be your most used elemental, at least for Prim, because she has the Cure Water spell. More importantly though, Papaw now has the Freeze spell, which is used to clear the way to the underground palace by the dwarf village. If it seems like I'm bouncing around a lot of key places just because I already know where to go, I should note that with rare exceptions, there are always at least 2 NPCs telling you where you can go next. In this case, both Eleni and Luca outright say you can get into the underground palace with Undine's magic. Hey, look what I can do with my boomerang! Magic is also a way the game prevents you from breaking sequence or going where you aren't supposed to, by blocking certain paths with switch orbs which are activated by particular magic. Have I mentioned how annoying it can be to get stun-locked by enemies who won't stop attacking you? Because that's how I burned through half of my cups of wishes in this dungeon, and it's one of my biggest gripes with the game as a whole. The one saving grace is that it doesn't happen very often, and it typically only happens to one character who gets separated from the group. A gnome appears and tells the group to get out, to which papaw responds by bitch-slapping him. This commotion causes a fire gigas to appear.
This is a good time to get acquainted with something called chain casting, one of the more broken mechanics in the game.
If you cast a spell, you have to wait until the casting and spell animations finish before casting again. Except you don't. By casting spell after spell, waiting for the part of the animation where the character ducks, you can effectively lock the enemy in place and or cancel out their attacks by casting magic really fast. This early on it's not as effective, since the free spell animation is pretty fast and you only have a few magic points. But as time goes on, chain casting will become even more effective. The gnome says he used you to get rid of the fire gigas, and papaw threatens to have his servant Randy beat him up. Gnome gives in and lends his magic to papaw and his wife, a remark which Prim doesn't take so well. It's minor, but the banter between characters is part of why I like this game so much. After sealing the mana seed, papaw regains his memory and asks that they go to his homeland in the Upperland Forest, which Randy absolutely loves doing for him. Prim finds her friend Fana, who says nothing and disappears. They go to the huge, ominous-looking ruins directly south of Pandora.
Who builds their town right next to that?
And Fana goes into them, with Prim brute forcing her way past the guards. Inside they find Thanatos, with both Fana and Diluc, their life force almost completely drained. Thanatos plans to unite the world, under him of course, by reviving the Mana Fortress. Then the trio get dropped into a fight with a wall.
That's the wall up there, brother!
I gloss over a lot of these bosses, but Wallface is a bit different from the others in that the third eye is the main target. The other eyes cast curative and offensive magic and can be closed, but the third eye will keep reviving them until the fight ends. Also, there are spikes along the bottom wall, so I don't know if this boss was supposed to close in on them gradually and that got removed, or if this is how it was always supposed to be. Either way, Thanatos runs off with Diluc and Fana, but at least the townspeople aren't zombies anymore. That includes the armor vendor, who previously wouldn't sell you anything. It also includes Gemma, who's confused why Thanatos was draining people's energy instead of manas. Oh well, time to go to the Water Palace again. Alright, Luca, what do you want Oh, the seed's been stolen and taken to Gaia's navel.
I haven't mentioned this until now, but there's another way to travel besides just walking everywhere. It's relatively cheap, and it's somehow gone several days without killing anybody.
The Canon Travel Agency, with locations all over the world, is exactly what it sounds like. I think the funniest part about this isn't that it doesn't hurt, but that if you land on an enemy, you'll damage them. If only Luke Perry were that lucky. The thieves, called the Scorpion Army, tore a hole through the middle of the dwarf village and plan to use the water seed to take over the world with their robot named
Kilroy! Kilroy! Kilroy!
But the seed is way too strong and the robot goes haywire, so much that it abruptly trades in its legs for a wheel. The thieves run off and... fucking hell. The Water Palace is overrun with monsters and Luke is being held for ransom by Geshtar, one of the Empire's generals. You can choose to give him the Mana Seed or make a run for it, but either way he ends up with it, breaks the seal, and tries feeding you to a... Jabberwocky? Not to be a literary snob, but Jabberwocky is the name of the poem, and the monster in it is called the Jabberwock. Take away that Y and trade it for the E that Recovered was missing earlier. Wait, did the Japanese version do the... Wait, what? Why'd they change it to the wrong name? You fix the seal, the Imperial forces withdraw, and Gemma says to go to the Upper Land. but Lucas says to go to the Lofty Mountains and meet a sage, which is much, much later in the game. Remember how I said the text for Secret of Mana was translated in large, unordered groups? This line got placed wrong in the final version. Papaw can't remember where his home is because he hit his head after that several hundred-foot fall.
As opposed to most other people in this situation, who would be dead.
A bunch of Moogles are crying because their village was taken over, so you go clear out the pebblers who were squatting there.
Blue streak speeds by. Sonic the Hedgehog.
Papaw remembers how to get back to his village, and after messing around with the statues that stick their tongues out, and seeing some dragons fly around, which, spoiler, are descendants of the Mana Beast which took on the fortress, find the village abandoned. Well, except for the Springbeak. They seal the next seed and find Papaw's grandfather, saying the Empire undid the Wind Seal. He explains that when humans break these seals and release monsters, it consumes mana, which is their life force.
Ah, sure, here we go. Just blame the humans for everything. I mean, it's actually right in this situation, but still.
Then he calls the Wind Elemental Sylphid to give you his powers. He's just called Jin in the Japanese version because, well, look at him, he's a genie. This includes the incredibly useful Analyzer spell. Not only can this spell tell you the remaining health and magic points, as well as the weaknesses of enemies and bosses, it can also disarm trapped chests. You have to use it on an orb to see what magic it'll activate and let you pass. Get used to it, because there are a lot of these in the rest of the game. What sucks about them is you can find out what elemental works against them, but not what specific spell. Sometimes you can end up wasting magic points trying to use the right one. The group emerges in Matango, or as I call it,
The Mushroom Kingdom.
King Truffle recounts the legend foretelling of how the three of them would save the world, riding on a white dragon, which was conveniently spotted in the mountains recently fighting a giant snake. I'd like to see that actually, but no. Better rest up before going to... okay? There are a couple of secret passages like this in Secret of Mana, but they don't go anywhere important. This is likely an unfortunate consequence of the cuts made to fit on a cartridge. After dealing with the snake, you find a white dragon wounded in a cave, its parents apparently killed by the serpent. King Truffle decides to take the dragon in and nurse it back to health, giving it the name Flammy. Think it sounds stupid? Well, tough shit, cause his mind's made up. He directs you to the Kakara Desert. And the group lands in the middle of it with no idea where to go. Prim spots a ship, but the moment they board it, they're accused of being Imperial spies and put to work as slave labor. Randy escapes with the help of a captured pirate named Sergo. Papaw eats their whole food supply and is told to get the hell out. And Prim, well, she's not taking any of the commander's shit. The Empire suddenly swarms the ship, led by Geshtar, who becomes a missile-launching mech rider and attacks. After driving them away, you run off from the remains of the sand ship, controlled by a group called the Republic. They'll play more of a role later in the game.
So you know what? You could say, early in the game, they're planting the seeds for it.
Kakara is a miserable place at the moment, because their water is dried up, the mana seed's stolen, and the fire elemental, Salamando, or Salamander, is missing from the nearby fire palace. Conveniently, there's a place in Ice Country that's as warm as it is here. After connecting the only two dots available, the three head there and stumble across a reindeer named Rudolph. This is and isn't going where you think it is. It's also a place where you can find a double orb chest. Orbs don't just come from boss fights, they can also be found, and it's possible to miss some of them in certain areas. So a few chests like these were put in by developers as a failsafe so you don't fall way behind on weapon forging. You do eventually find a nice warm resort out of nowhere, which the Scorpion army are using to rake in money. Unfortunately, they put Tweedledum in charge of a big stove in the middle of it. Once you open it, Salamando pops out, gives you his powers, and the resort freezes over. Salamando's spells are what you'd expect, except for Prim. To this point, she's had curative spells and weapon or status buffs, but with Salamando she gains the spells Fire Bouquet, which deals damage and debuffs an enemy, and Blaze Wall, which engulfs an enemy in fire and slowly damages them. Basically, it's poison, except the enemy can't move. Still no Mana Seed though. Well, let's check the Ice Palace for— oh good god, wait, no, go back! That book just opened up to a centerfold of a naked lady. Nintendo changed the teleporters to not look like six-sided stars, but this got through? Well, I guess it explains why the palette swap of this monster is called a Devil Magazine in the Japanese version.
I like to think Nintendo of America knew about this Easter egg and still gave the game, and that particular Easter egg, their seal of approval.
A trio of lizards later, and you find a Frost Gigas. And now with Salamando, chain casting is even more broken. If the spell's animation is long enough, you can cast it again before the damage value appears, freezing the enemy in place and causing the damage values to stack as high as 999. Anyway, it turns out the Frost Gigas was really Santa Claus! And he became a monster because when mana fades, kids stop believing in him. So he stole a Mana Seed to grow a giant Christmas tree, and it turned him into a monster.
All I got from that is Santa Claus is canon in the Seiken Densetsu series.
Now the seed has to go back to the Fire Palace, and after politely convincing the Minotaur to explode, and after replacing the seal on the seed, Kakara still doesn't have any water. Well, shit. This is actually something I don't like about Secret of Mana, how it organizes side quests. There is a way to get the water back, and it's hinted at by the townspeople, but you can't do it until later in the game. There are other special items you can get, which you may never find on a first playthrough because of how out of the way they are. But I'll explain that later. To the Empire! You hook up with a rebel group and sneak through the sewers to the north side of town, where the rebellion hides in an oversized cafe. Yeah, the Empire won't think to look for them in one of the largest buildings in the middle of town. They're led by an 18-year-old girl named Chrissy because her dad was captured. She's coping as best she can.
Something I haven't mentioned to this point. This game, despite the bright, colorful graphics, was supposed to have a much darker tone. I mean, there are still dark moments and places and characters in this, but it kind of makes you wonder how far down the rabbit hole Ishii was going to go with it before they had to make all the cuts.
Chrissy says a guy named Diluc is draining people's energy at a nearby Wait a minute, this sounds familiar. Oh, come on, Vanna, have you no scruples? Vanna and Prim have a Jerry Springer moment over Diluc before Chrissy takes her back to their base. This place has 2 boss fights, so I'd highly recommend not doing them both in one go. Magic rope out, restock, and go back in. Diluc's back to his old never mind, it's a trap. Thanatos tries using Prim's life force to sustain himself, but Diluc comes to and strengthens her spirit. Then comes the vampire fight. Unlike the Final Fantasy Adventure version of this boss, I got stuck on this as a kid because the vampire's weakness is an elemental you haven't found yet, and he spends much of the fight out of reach of conventional weapons. And he kept putting Papaw to sleep, which broke up my chain casting. Thanatos disappears with Diluc again, much to Prim's chagrin, but look on the bright side. The Emperor, out of fucking nowhere, wants a truce with the rebellion. Surely this is a sign that hostilities will cease and it was a trick to capture the Resistance and the Mana Knight.
I understand that you're good guys and all, but the G in good doesn't have to stand for gullible.
I haven't mentioned it much, but beyond the midpoint of this game, there's usually some kind of puzzle solving involved in getting through dungeons, palaces, and the like. They're not too complex, in fact most of them just involve finding and hitting a switch, but they don't add enough time to each place to make them feel like blatant busy work. Geshtar asks for one last shot at kicking your ass, hops on his mech cycle thing, and you can guess how this ends. Geshtar resolves to take you down with him, but out of nowhere, King Truffle swoops in on Flammy, who's now healthy enough to fly and thinks you're his parent. This is where the game completely opens up. With Flammy, you can fly anywhere on the map and land on anything that isn't a mountain, trees, or a building. And with the Flammy drum, you can call him from any outdoor location and take to the skies. The compass directions are nice, but they don't display on the map, which can make it confusing at first which direction you're facing. For the record, on the map you're always facing up, so line up where you want to go and fly in a straight line. On the plus side, you can see some weird shit that got added to the map, like how there's a face in the middle of the ocean, one that looks similar to the face on Mars, which was also thrown into Final Fantasy IV. There's also a town on the back of a giant sea turtle. This has been done several times over thousands of years of storytelling, but I like to think Ishii came up with this after watching the Neverending Story. If you go to this village, you'll find a desperate merchant who sells nothing but sea hair tails. So of course he gives you one for free. What kind of business model is this? But wait, a sea hair tail is what Kakura needs to get their water back. Somehow. One short detour later, the Oases return and the mayor rewards you with the Moogle Belt, which can activate and undo the Moogle status on any party member, saving you from using herbs or casting Remedy every time. Off to the lofty mountains, where the townsfolk think you're a scrub for having to fly to get there. This is one of the few times I did any grinding in the game. Not for levels, mind you, but for money. Armor gets expensive in the latter stages, so if you haven't been grinding at all, this is around the time you'll likely have to kill a few extra enemies to be able to afford new armor pieces. Or grind to get a level 5 whip attack so you can pull off goofy shit like this. And they're stuck. So you go to the top of the mountain to see Sage... How do I pronounce this?
Josh!
Josh, sure. Well, he's not home, so his bird buddy Jack tells you to go to the Palace of Darkness, which looks like... Wait, weren't there trees in the background before? Anyway, it's a literal hole in the wall. A nice hole in the wall, but a hole in the wall with a giant slime at the end of it. So Josh isn't here, but a Monoseed and the Darkness Elemental Shade are. This is the first elemental which only gives magic to one character, papaw.
Yeah, of course the mischievous little bitch or bastard gets the dark magic.
Jack says Josh really went to the gold aisle, which is exactly what it sounds like. It's entirely made of gold. Sure, that's causing it to sink into the ocean, but look at all this gold! It's also home to the most realistic portrayal of customer service I've seen in an SNES game. Unfortunately, there's so much gold because alchemists are using mana to turn everything into it. One kind of annoying bit of backtracking for a key later, you find, hey, this looks familiar! So it dies and throws a second head? Okay, after killing it twice, you get to fight a palette swapped the Gorgon Bull. Then you find the elemental Lumina, who was being forced to make gold for the king. Since Papaw got Shade's dark magic, Prim gets Lumina's light magic. It also marks the first straight-up attack spell for Prim, Lucent Beam. Short of character constraints, I'm not sure why Lumina's name was changed from its Japanese one, Will-O-Wisp. Surprise, Josh wasn't there. This time Jack says he went to the Moon Palace.
You wanna go to the moon? Do you wanna go to the moon?
So it's off to Kakura to take the ferry to the Moon Palace, which is piloted by a guy you can straight up murder. It's okay, he responds. This is arguably the area most affected by content cuts. Apparently Sage Josh decided to
Turn these lights out!
But even so, 90% of the dungeon is just finding an orb and casting Lucent Beam on it, which teleports you to the end. I didn't remember where to go, and I still got through this part in under 30 seconds. Either way, you meet Luna and get her magic, and Josh is still nowhere to be found.
You can actually get Shade, Lumina, and Luna out of order, but this is the natural progression, or I guess I should say, the natural order of things. Dark magic, light magic, weird magic.
I'm not going into detail on most elementals and the spells they give because there are just too many to go over, but most have at least one useful non-attack spell, like how Gnome has Defender or Shade has Dispel, which can get rid of protective magic barriers. Luna, however, is a different story, having both awesome and flat-out strange spells. Among her 3 spells, Prim gets Moon Energy, which gives a certain amount of guaranteed critical hits to whomever it's cast on, and Moon Saber, which boosts a weapon's attack and allows it to absorb health from whatever it hits. Then there's Papaw. He gets Magic Absorb, which means not burning through fairy walnuts as fast for him, but from there it's a goofy crapshoot. He has Change Form, which turns an enemy into a different, usually weaker enemy. And then there's lunar magic, which randomly screws with all enemies and often your party, knocking everyone unconscious, pygmizing the entire group, boosting or dropping a bunch of stats. There are a set number of permutations, but it's random which one will happen. By the way, don't cast change form on a boss at the maximum level or it might crash the game. Back to the mountain, and something I haven't mentioned yet. If you go north from the village, you'll find some ruins dating back to before the initial rise of the Mana Fortress. And it has videos. These orbs, or the ones that work, are actually pretty interesting. One discusses Lorima, formerly Lorim, launching missiles at the Empire. Another is of people scoffing at the idea mana is not an unlimited resource. The main one is a live news report of the Mana Beast attacking the fortress. And then one is an old clip of Jeopardy where Abe Lincoln is the answer.
It's pretty clear by now that technology was much more advanced in the past before the clash between the Mana Fortress and the Mana Beast. But more importantly, Santa Claus, Jeopardy, and Abraham Lincoln are canon in the Seiken Densetsu series.
You'll never believe this, but Josh still isn't here. This time Jek says he's in Tasnica. So you go there and shit, there's a spy in the castle. And everyone in the castle can only say, "Where's the spy?"
Whenever Poochie's not on screen, all the other characters should be asking, "Where's Poochie?"
Turns out, the king is the spy, named Sheiks, one of the Emperor's men, and he's not much of a fighter. 3 things. 1. Tasnica is the republic that Sandship was part of, so the republic has accused this trio of being spies on 2 separate occasions. 2. It's revealed Gemma had a friend named Saren who fought alongside him, and his death caused Gemma to walk away from battle. 3. Josh isn't here either. You'd have a better time chasing down Carmen Sandiego at this rate. Finally, Josh is here, and he says you have to take a test of courage. But what could our heroes face that's a challenge given what they've gone through to this point? Yeah, they face themselves. Prim's and Papoy's shadows don't use magic, so this isn't much of a challenge. Jek reveals the old man was an illusion, and he was Josh the entire time, saying he had to be sure they'd found their inner strength.
Well, gosh golly gee, thanks, Josh. By the way, if we're too late and the Empire raises the Mana Fortress because you were giving us the runaround earlier, I'm feeding you to Flammy.
He directs you to a palace on top of a coral reef, which hides the Mana Fortress beneath it. But first, here's a lighthouse which serves no real purpose. Guess who beat us here? The Emperor has been breaking the seals we redid and has just this one left before the continent will rise from the sea. Sheiks offers to kill the trio and turns into a giant demonic watermelon? Whatever underworld powers you have, Sheiks, they're clearly not working out. The group chases the Emperor to the staging area, but the seal on the seed is already broken. The tree spirit Dryad says to get out and she'll go down, or I guess up, with the palace, but the group convinces Dryad to give them her powers. The catch is, Thanatos sealed some of her magic, so Papoy and Prim can only cast 2 of her spells.
And that's the last elemental in Secret of Mana. Man, Dryad kinda got shafted by not being included until the last few hours of the game. But at least, you can grind all of the elementals to their maximum level now.
Aside from spells being more effective at higher levels, some of them change visual effects as they progress, namely when they hit level 8 and have a chance of doing a special animation. You can tell when this happens because every enemy, character, and background animation freezes until it's over. Most of the time it's just the animation looping or looking slightly larger, but some are noticeably different. Lucent Beam usually has just 4 beams, but then it turns into a tangled web of beams. This is what Earthslide looks like normally, but at level 8, sometimes there's a face on the rock. Gem Missile usually looks like this, but at level 8, sometimes it summons a huge diamond which breaks apart and stabs the enemy. Fireball looks less like fireballs and more like dragons that just happen to explode into flames.
I do like that there's a reason to grind all these elementals up, aside from just stronger spells. And actually, there's a bit of an Easter egg hidden in one of these spells.
The shade spell Evil Gate, when cast at level 8, sometimes looks like this, brightening the screen and showing a larger version of the normal portal. However, if you get it to level 8 and grind the spell so it reads as having 99 points, very rarely, this will happen. A bunch of the shadow enemies from the first Seiken Densetsu, called Shadow Zeros here, show up. They can also appear out of random treasure chests, but somehow that's never happened to me. Oh, right, the continent is rising out of the ocean and the Mana Fortress is almost in the hands of the Empire. Gemma says to head to the ancient city, which starts off ancient looking enough. Then the people movers show up, and the force fields, and the color-coded computers, and the subway. Before anyone asks about the train-like transportation loaded with undead entities, Final Fantasy VI came out about a year after this. And no, you can't suplex the subway car. Oh goddammit, it's these guys again. And they're trying to steal the Mana Sword this time. Hello, Kettlekin. Sorry, I didn't recognize you at first without the chainsaw, or your Japanese name, Death Machine. And that's the last appearance by the Scorpion Army in the game. They're like an even less effective version of Yaraman's Doronbo gang. All of that somehow opened a shortcut through the palace, but considering how long it takes to get through this section, I don't think shortcut is the word to use for it. You have to use damn near every elemental on a series of orbs to open up more of the palace, and at the end, you get your very own dead emperor.
From the looks of it, he died standing up. He may or may not be part horse.
Fana backstabbed the Emperor to rule alongside Thanatos, who is about to use Dialek's body as the new vessel for his spirit. Then she turns into a Hexus and attacks. She uses Pygmus Glare a lot, but if she uses it on Papaw, that actually makes the fight really easy. You see, the pygmized form doesn't have as many sprites for it, so while you can't attack anything effectively, it makes the casting animation and recovery time on spells much faster. As such, if Papaw is pygmized, he can nuke enemies almost twice as fast as usual. With all of the Emperor's generals and the Emperor himself down, Thanatos is all that's left. Or that would be the case if he didn't use Geshtar's corpse to make his own mech rider. How utterly evil. And so Thanatos activates the Mana Fortress, causing the rest of the continent to sink and the fortress to launch into the sky, which moves around at random on the map. That said, the trio can't get into the fortress yet. It seems like all is lost. The Mana Beast will crash into the fortress and the world will end. However, with the fortress soaking up so much mana, the barriers blocking the Pure Land, the home of the Mana Tree, have thinned out. Since the tree is stronger than its seeds, it could revive the Mana Sword much faster. But, for the love of God, don't miss the Neko Trader on the other side of the palace. Without the armor he sells, you'll get outright slaughtered by the monsters in the Pure Land. Just look at the difference in defense values on some of this equipment.
I don't know what made me angrier. Missing this on my first playthrough, or that because the armor is being sold by Neko, it's always going to be way more expensive than it should be. Neko is like the Seiken Densetsu equivalent of an eBay scalper.
If you feel like it, you can duck inside the palace and see some old friends, namely Fana reconciling with Prim. How did she and some of the other characters who weren't here already suddenly show up at the palace? Well, I left the answer for that in my car. Just a moment. Hey, check it out! After the seals have been broken on all the mana seeds, the orbs in the mana power section of the status screen go dark. Sometimes it's the little things in games.
Wait. Little things. Oh shit, I completely forgot!
You can actually do this much earlier, but at some point go back to the dwarf village and talk to the elder to get the Midge Mallet, which is what Papaw used in the sideshow. It not only undoes the Pygmy status, but you can use it to easily chain cast attack spells whenever you want. The Pure Land is a massive forest on an island far from civilization, with a long series of bosses, mostly dragons, but fortunately there are gates to save before each one. This all leads to the Mana Tree. Now they can revive the Mana Sword and defeat the Fortress, which is currently firing at the Mana Tree shit. What's left of the Mana Tree warns that the Mana Beast, a wild and uncontrollable amalgamation of all monsters, could end the world by attacking the Fortress. The one way to stop it is with the Mana Sword, which can only be wielded by someone from the Mana tribe. Like Randy's father, the legendary knight Saren. That ghost Randy saw by the falls? Yep, that was him. And the dying tree speaking to him? That's his mother. Like Fuji in the first Seiken Densetsu, she became the Mana Tree. And with her last bit of energy, she unleashes the sword's full potential and dies. A grief-stricken Randy, after some consoling from his partners, resolves to take on Thanatos and the Mana Fortress, which you don't really land on so much as get Flammy to do a flyby of it.
While this gets you access to the Mana Sword during the final battle, there is technically a way to glitch the game and get it earlier. See, every weapon in the game has 8 orbs associated with it to forge it to the next strongest weapon, except for the sword, which only has 7. But
use Flammy to fly to a small island at the back of Ice Country. If you did it right, you'll appear in front of Neko. Save there and use the controller to reset the game. Start a new game and play up until the Mantis Ant fight. Hold the reset command for 5 seconds or so and load up the other save, and you'll appear at the Mantis Ant fight. Ending this fight gives you the extra orb to get the Mana Sword, and it's really powerful, especially against living things. You might notice I'm not using my own recorded footage for this glitch, and that's because I play off my original cartridge. Doing this glitch has the potential to corrupt or wipe out one or all save files on a cartridge. So, yeah, I'm not doing it. The Fortress has a number of enemies that can kick your ass even with the right armor, but they also have a chance of dropping rare items, like the best armor pieces in the game, which can't be bought anywhere, or even the last orb to forge each weapon. Although that's assuming you remember to use Analyzer to disarm any trapped chests. Like the Pure Land, this has its own series of bosses, but the last 2 are story-related. Thanatos' body falls apart, but before it does, he manages to transfer his being into Dialog. Dialog manages to briefly regain control and say goodbye to Prim before, and this is very loosely implied by the dialogue, killing himself. Thanatos, with no body, emerges as a dark lich and attacks, trying to take over the bodies of Randy and company. And just to drive home how evil he is, he has 6,666 health.
technically that's one too many 6s to be evil, but you tried.
With Thanatos dead, the seal on Dryad's magic disappears, and a third spell appears for both Prim and Papoy. Before Prim can begin grieving over Diluc, the Mana Beast arrives. Randy says he won't hurt it because it means well in restoring mana, and that if Papoy uses up his mana abilities, he'll disappear. Papoy claims he'll be fine, it's just that because this world is separate from his, he won't see Randy or Prim again. He adds that if they don't do anything, the world ends, so backing down isn't an option. So really, everyone in this group already has or will sacrifice something close to them to try and save the world. The fight begins and oh my god, I love this song. Although if you watch my strumming the bassline videos, you would already know how much I like it. The Mana Beast, which has no resemblance whatsoever to the Thunder Dragon in Saga Frontier for the PlayStation, can only be damaged during a certain part of the fight, and the rest is just about surviving. Dryad's third spell, Mana Magic, is unlocked. When both Prim and Papoy cast it on Randy, it awakens the Mana Sword, the only thing that can damage the Mana Beast. Which, and I think this is obvious, but it is related to Flammy. These beings are part of a continuous cycle of destruction and rebirth the planet and everything living on it goes through. Speaking of, the Mana Beast is slain and Mode 7's its way out of existence. Sadly, it does take Papoy with it, but as a consolation, the Mana Beast turns into snow. It then descends at a steady pace upon the quiet town of Silent Hill. No, wait, wrong series. Randy is allowed to return to Potos, and shortly thereafter, returns the sword to the stone by the waterfall for when it might be needed again. and papaw, on his own plane of existence, takes in the crescent moon. This moon can actually be a full moon or a 3/4 moon as well, though I'm not sure what exactly causes it.
Probably related to item collection and completion time if I had to guess. Although I don't know if Square could have guessed how much this game would have resonated with its fans.
When talking about how Secret of Mana performed commercially, you have to break it down into a few regions. The game sold about 1.8 million copies worldwide, about 2 times what the first game did, and in Japan it sold out shortly after being released. Outside of Japan, not so much. Of those 1.8 million copies, only about 300,000 were sold outside of Japan. UK publication Edge noted that despite Square's efforts abroad, Secret of Mana released with little hype and flew way under the radar. Still, that global number puts it in the top 25 on the list of best-selling SNES games. To help give some perspective, here's a short list of games that sold less globally for the SNES. Kikuta's music has been orchestrated and remixed several times, even though he said it was never made to be played live, including a few fan-made CDs like this one, Project Delta's Sanctuary of Mana. There was also a CD called Secret of Mana Plus, which had one 50-minute long track with lots of experimental sounds and rearranged bits of the game's tracks. Critically, Famitsu gave it the exact same score as Final Fantasy Adventure, but others were even more positive. Some publications, like Next Generation, credited it with helping grow the popularity of RPGs in the West. Most of the publications I could find from the time gave it 8s or 9s out of 10, with EGM and GamePro both awarding it Best RPG of 1993. The lowest review score I could find, and you're gonna love this, it was in Nintendo Power Volume 54, the one with Secret of Mana on the cover. They gave it the equivalent of a 7.3 out of 10, saying the item selection system was awkward and powering up the sword made battles long and tedious.
Long and tedious as in a couple minutes? Don't put any stock into that. They rated the game about the same as Tony Meola's Sidekick Soccer and said in the review blurb that Secret of Mana was a 5-player game. Nintendo Power reviewers were shit.
I know some have lamented the cuts that were made to get this on a cartridge, and while I do wonder what the game might have looked like with that extra content, I don't let that undermine my enjoyment of what we did get. Secret of Mana at 60% is still a game I would take over most anything else at 100%. Square must have realized something about this particular game stuck with people, because it's been re-released a few times since. It was going to be released on the WonderSwan Color handheld in the early 2000s, but that got cancelled. Nintendo added it to the Japanese Wii Virtual Console in 2008, then the Wii U Virtual Console in 2013. And yes, the multiplayer works in those. Eventually, it was ported to Japanese mobile devices in 2009, then made its way to iOS and Android worldwide in the coming years, with several bug fixes and a retranslated script. Nintendo saw fit to include Secret of Mana as one of 21 games on the Super NES Classic Edition, alongside another Square RPG, Final Fantasy VI. Square also released Secret of Mana as part of a 3-game Seiken Densetsu collection on the Nintendo Switch in June of 2017, which is awesome. Are you fucking kidding me, Square? Wait, Square? Nintendo? Which one of you do I blame for this? Well, at least the console's region-free, but good luck making it through Seiken Densetsu 3 not knowing any Japanese. Seemingly out of nowhere, Square announced a 3D remake for Secret of Mana, coming to PC, PS4, and something called a PS Vita in 2018. Finally, a 3D remake of a Square game I actually give a shit about. Even if the voice acting I've heard so far makes my skin crawl.
Yeah, we're not supposed to be here. Everyone in the village knows about the ghost.
Secret of Mana's design itself would also have a lasting impact, with the ring command menu system and the drop-in drop-out multiplayer being applied to other RPGs and RPG-like games over the years. And that would hold true for the next entry in the Seiken Densetsu... Wait, this isn't part of the Seiken Densetsu series.